right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Carly Cipolla. I'm the Director of Operations with the American Solar Energy Society. I want to welcome everyone for joining us here today for our October webinar. Just going to do a little welcome, and then we'll go ahead and pass it on to Brian and Autumn, who are here to present the content today. So I just want to remind everyone that you can join ASES for priority access to our webinars. ASES.org/join is the link you'd want to go to. If you had an ASES membership and it has expired, you can also go to ases.org/renew to renew your membership. I also want to thank anyone who has joined us on the National Solar Tour this year. It was a couple weeks back, and then we had some tours the couple last weekends of this month, and it was extremely successful. I want to thank everyone who was able to join us for that, and then also to let you know to mark your calendars for next year. The National Solar Tour will be October 3rd and 4th of 2020. Also, the ASES National Solar Conference is being planned right now. Registration we're looking to open before Thanksgiving. And also our call for participation is open now. Here's some information here in the graphic. The proposal deadline is January 15th. You can also go to ases.org/conference for some more information on what we're doing at Solar 2020. The theme is Renewable Energy Vision. We'll be in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University. Also wanted to let you know our next webinar will be in November, and it will be a presentation from one of our ASES friends, Bill Ellard. Registration will be opening for that within the next few weeks, so keep an eye out for an email from ASES about that. If you need to join our emails to be sure that you get the latest information about webinars, conference information, all of that, ases.org is where you can go to sign up for that. And now I'd like to present Autumn Proudlove and Brian Lips, who are here with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center and the database of state incentives for renewable energy and efficiency, the Desire program. So here to talk about distributed solar policies across the country, Autumn Proudlove and Brian Lips.
All right. One moment while I pull up the slides. All right, so thank you for the introduction, Carly, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Carly mentioned, Autumn and I work for the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center at NC State University. And as she mentioned, we're home to Desire, which I hope most of you are familiar with. The center has been managing Desire for more than 20 years. For most of that time, Desire was fully funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, but unfortunately, the new administration had different priorities and elected to stop funding Desire. We take pride in Desire and the valuable public good it provides, so we've been continuing to maintain it without that federal funding. But if you also value Desire and want to help support it, there's a link on the homepage where you can give a tax-deductible donation to help with those efforts. Now, while continuing to maintain Desire, our policy team has also taken on new research projects and launched new policy resources, and we'll be sharing some of that research with you today. So Desire provides information on the existing policies and incentives for renewables and efficiency across all 50 states, but you'll only find a policy or incentive in Desire once it's been fully implemented. Additionally, Desire has a discrete set of policy types it tracks, which has not changed in close to 10 years. But starting out about 5 years ago, we started noticing the policy environment evolving. Incentives are still an important piece of the puzzle, but with PV prices declining so much in recent years, there are now fewer financial incentives than there were in the heyday of maybe 10 years ago. And so now other factors like rate design and third-party ownership laws, which are not covered by Desire, are growing in importance. Additionally, we started noticing a market need for more timely information about these policies while the sausage is being made, so to speak. as state legislators and regulators are developing them, and there is still a chance for advocates to help shape them. And so we started publishing a quarterly report series called the 50 States of Solar, which tracks some of these new policy categories and provides details about these developments while they're still being discussed in state houses and regulatory commissions. After offering these reports for free for a couple of years, we started charging for them because, well, our Desire funding ran out. So this is a way for us to keep Desire running and, frankly, for our employment status to continue. So building off the success of our 50 States of Solar report series, a couple years ago, we launched 50 States of Grid Modernization, another quarterly report, which tracks policy developments related to grid modernization, including AMI deployments and rules, smart grid investments, energy storage proposals, innovative rate design, alternative utility business models, and more. And then shortly after that, we expanded again with the 50 States of Electric Vehicles report series, which provides detailed information on EV policies and incentives, as well as rate designs and utility transportation electrification plans, and other policy issues affecting the market for EVs. And then to bring us up to the present day here, late last year, we launched a new website, which you can see a screen capture of here, and a new subscription service under the name Desire Insight. In addition to purchasing individual reports or an annual subscription to the reports, we also have additional policy resources bundled under a series of subscription options, including bi-weekly policy tracking updates, policy data sheets, live webinars, and more. If you'd like to know more about this, you can see our subscription options and pricing at www.desireinsight.com. And since we live in this world and are concerned about global warming and want to see good policies spread across the country, we do offer our reports for free to policymakers, which includes elected officials, utility commissions, and state energy office staff. We also offer discounted pricing for nonprofits. So if you fit into any of those categories, contact us after the webinar and we'll hook you up. So that's the end of my sales pitch. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll use the rest of this time to provide some insight into the recent policy trends surrounding distributed solar. So I'll start by going through some of the broad trends we've seen over the past few years related to distributed solar policy. And then we'll zero in on the discrete policy categories that we track in our quarterly reports. And then we'll provide a forward look at where we see things headed. So looking broadly at 2018, just about every state in the country took some sort of action related to distributed solar policy. In some cases, these may be relatively small, discrete actions, but in other states, policymakers have taken sweeping action with significant implications for local solar markets. So this is a very active space, ever-changing and shifting the market opportunity for solar. It's a lot to keep up with, but that's what we do. So some of the major trends we've seen in recent years. First, net metering transitions. Net metering has been the most important policy tool for distributed solar over the past couple of decades. It gives utility customers a simple and predictable value proposition for their investment. And states like California, New Jersey, and Hawaii with strong net metering policies have built strong markets for solar. But sometimes success can breed skepticism, and we've seen a wave of states consider net metering alternatives or successor tariffs in recent years. In some cases, that becomes a value of solar tariff discussion, but in the past few years, most of the states that have adopted a true successor to net metering have implemented net billing programs. Through net billing, the customer can self-consume, but any instantaneous exports to the grid are credited at some other value, unlike net metering, where exports are netted over the course of the month at the retail rate and treated as bill credits. Now, before adopting a net meter successor tariff, many states have first undertaken a study to inform the process. In some cases, it's a cost-benefit analysis of net metering, and in other cases, it's a full-blown study of the value of solar or the value of DG more broadly. Now, these states have taken place in many states, and no two are the same. The results of the studies can come out much differently depending on what values are quantified and how those values are quantified. If you left it entirely in the hands of a utility, most utilities would basically use their methodology for calculating the avoided cost rate, ignoring many of the values that solar advocates would associate with solar. And of course, even if the same values are quantified in two states, the ultimate values could come out quite differently due to the unique situations in those states. So it's hard to give any kind of blanket statement about the value of solar or DG. I can't say that this is the value of solar, which is uniform across all 50 states. These are all very state-specific exercises. And with many of the states that have undertaken these studies in recent years, they've done so while contemplating the future of net metering. In most cases, these states are trying to uncover whether or not there is any cross-subsidization going on. Are solar customers avoiding paying their fair share of the fixed costs of maintaining the grid and pushing those costs onto non-solar utility customers? Or are they actually being undercompensated for all the value they're providing to the grid? So states see these studies as providing valuable data to them to help determine the proper direction to go in with regards to net metering or successor tariffs. So following along with that, another trend we've seen in recent years is related to rate design. Now, most utilities have two components in their customers' bills: a fixed monthly customer charge and a variable per kilowatt hour charge. Now, utilities have variable costs they incur related to how much fuel they have to burn to provide their customers with electricity, but they also incur fixed costs associated with their transmission and distribution systems that have to be maintained, regardless of how much electricity is flowing through them. And given the way rates are typically designed in this country, many of those fixed costs to the utility are recouped through the variable rates they charge their customers. So in recent years, we've seen utilities arguing to recoup more or even all of their fixed costs through their fixed customer charges. For example, in 2008, Duke Energy in South Carolina requested an increase in its fixed monthly customer charge from less than $10 per month to nearly $30 per month. Of course, these increases in the fixed charge are sometimes coupled with a decrease in the variable rate that customers pay. So the average customer might not see much of a difference in the total amount they pay on a monthly basis. But what's that do to customers with solar? Well, they can potentially zero out their electricity charges through net metering, but they can't zero out that fixed charge. So this type of a rate shift can dramatically impact the economics of going solar. I'll note this also diminishes the value of purchasing an energy efficient air conditioner or refrigerator or water heater. So there are broad implications for such a change in rate design. And this has been a popular approach for utilities in recent years. In 2018 alone, we noted 77 pending or decided utility proposals in 36 states to increase their residential fixed charges by at least 10%. Now, for the most part, regulators have been somewhat reluctant to award these full increases to the utilities. Of the fixed charge decisions made in 2018, only 5 requests were fully approved at the level that the utility requested. 12 were denied outright, and 26 were partially approved. And we've seen similar numbers in previous years. Perhaps in response to this less than stellar success rate, we've seen a gradual decrease in the fixed charge increases being requested by utilities. In 2018, the median increase requested by utilities was $4 per month, while the 10 new requests submitted by utilities during the third quarter of this year had a median increase of just $3. So now we'll look at some of the specific policy actions we've seen so far in 2019 in each of the policy categories we track in our 50 States of Solar reports. Starting with the value of solar and net metering studies. During the third quarter of 2019, 15 states either committed to studying or continued studying some element of the value of distributed generation. So far this year, just one full study has been completed. Acadian Consulting was contracted by the Mississippi Public Service Commission to calculate, excuse me, the total avoided cost rates for solar in the service territories of Entergy, Mississippi, and Mississippi Power. The avoided cost rates are based on avoided generation capacity, avoided transmission and distribution capacity, and avoided costs related to line losses and ancillary services costs. So this doesn't include any of the societal benefits that have been included in other studies. They then applied an effective load carrying capability of 28.7% to account for a solar resources availability during the hours the system is peaking, which resulted in values of 3.488 cents per kilowatt hour for Entergy, Mississippi, and 2.659 cents per kilowatt hour for Mississippi Power. So fairly small values when compared to the numbers arrived at in other states. Oregon, for example, has an ongoing proceeding to calculate what they call the resource value of solar. The Public Utility Commission started this process back in 2015 with workshops and hearings to determine the appropriate value categories to include, ultimately deciding on 11 elements, including energy, generation capacity, transmission and distribution capacity, line losses, administration expenses, excuse me, market price response, RPS compliance, integration and ancillary services, hedge value, environmental compliance, and security and reliability. The Commission then established methodologies for quantifying each of these values and then required the investor-owned utilities in the state to calculate their actual resource values of solar based on that methodology. The utilities then filed their calculations during the first quarter of this year. Pacific Corp calculated a real value of 5.086 cents per kilowatt hour and a nominal value of 6.244 cents per kilowatt hour. Idaho Power calculated 4.273 cents per kilowatt hour for standard size projects and 4.716 cents per kilowatt hour for utility scale projects. And Portland General Electric calculated a value of 4.988 cents per kilowatt hour for December of 2017 and 5.016 cents per kilowatt hour for March of 2019. The utilities then filed updated values this past July, which are slightly higher than those previous values. And lawmakers are also interested in answering this question of the value of solar. Legislation was enacted this year in Connecticut, South Carolina, and Washington, all commissioning values of solar studies. In the case of South Carolina and Connecticut, the bills say that the resulting values will be used in net metering successor tariffs. So these aren't just complicated math problems for stakeholders to work on. They actually have real implications for solar markets. Moving on to community solar, 18 states plus DC took action related to community solar during the third quarter of this year. And this year, Utah became the 20th state to authorize community solar during the quarter. House Bill 411 authorizes Rocky Mountain Power to file an application for community renewable energy programs, though it has a very specific requirement that participating customers must be located in a municipality or county that adopts a resolution by the end of 2019, pledging to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2030. A number of other states also considered legislation to authorize community solar this year, including Florida, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. Some of these bills died during the year, but Nevada and South Carolina both saw their community solar legislation approved, paving the way for community solar to enter those markets. The South Carolina bill specifically encourages all utilities to consider offering community solar and calls on the Commission to open proceedings for each utility to review their existing community solar programs and consider expanding them. And so the Public Service Commission now has 4 open proceedings related to community solar. Nevada's bill is a little less specific and requires NV Energy to develop an expanded solar access program, which could include community solar options. There's now an open proceeding in Nevada's Public Utility Commission to develop the rules for that program. A handful of other states that already have community solar in place introduced bills during the year that would tinker with the rules. Minnesota, one of the leading states for community solar, stood out with at least 16 bills at one point related to community solar being introduced. Many of these bills related to consumer protection rules, but others would increase the system size limit or remove proximity rules for subscribers. However, none of those bills were approved. 3 other existing community solar states, however, were successful in passing legislation related to community solar this year. Lawmakers in Maine and Maryland both lifted the caps on the number of subscribers to community solar projects. Maine also mandated an additional 250 megawatts of shared DG resources by 2024. And Maryland, which is actually operating under a pilot program, saw the expiration date for the pilot program extended to the end of 2024 at the earliest. Colorado, one of the leading community solar states, took action both in the legislature and in the Public Utilities Commission this year. The legislature approved legislation that increases the size limit for community solar projects from 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts, and also removed a requirement that subscribers must be located in the same county or an adjacent county to where a project is located, so making the program a bit more flexible. And the Utilities Commission in Colorado opened a new proceeding to tinker with its community solar rules. The changes under consideration relate to low-income customers sharing the benefits of community solar. Specifically, the Commission is considering whether to allow other community solar participants to contribute excess bill credits to a nonprofit established for low-income energy assistance. And Colorado is not alone in its consideration of low-income customers in community solar. Just about all the legislation related to community solar we saw this year has included some sort of provision to increase access to low-income customers. The commissions, too, are considering low-income customer participation. Oregon, for example, is in its 3rd year of developing its community solar rules, and the commission is currently working through just a few remaining issues, one of which is related to low-income customers. The commission staff recently recommended a 10% carve-out for low-income customers, coupled with a subscription discount for those customers. So lots of attention being devoted to ensuring that these are equitable programs. Moving on to third-party ownership of solar, policymakers and regulators in just 4 states considered the legality of third-party PPAs or solar leases during the 3rd quarter of 2019, with state legislatures adjourning earlier this year in most states. There hasn't been a whole lot of activity on this topic in recent months. In Arkansas, the legislature legalized solar leasing earlier in the year, and legislators in Virginia authorized third-party PPAs for tax-exempt customers of electric cooperatives. Since the enactment of the Arkansas bill, the Public Service Commission has started its process of developing regulations for solar leases. And in Wisconsin, a solar company filed a lawsuit requesting a declaratory ruling that its solar services agreement with the city of Milwaukee does not constitute a public utility service. The Wisconsin Public Service Commission has declined to address the legality of leasing and third-party PPAs. Interestingly, in Ohio a few years ago, the state Supreme Court ruled that PPAs between this same solar company and the city of Dubuque did not constitute a utility service. So there's definitely some similarity between those 2 cases. Similar cases have also arisen in Nevada and Florida this year. In Nevada, a renewable energy company filed a petition in August for a declaratory order from the commission stating that a renewable energy facility delivering electricity to just one customer is not subject to regulation as a public utility. That case is ongoing, but it is supported by the commission staff. And in Florida, regulators issued a declaratory statement on petitions filed by Tesla and IGS Solar, allowing their residential solar equipment leases to go forward. The commission actually included in Tesla's order that any cases with an identical fact pattern don't actually need to go through this process since they've already ruled on it several times. And with that, I'll hand it over to Autumn.
All right, thanks, Brian. So now let's move on to DG compensation policies. There were 53 actions ongoing or under consideration in 27 states plus DC during Q3 2019, making DG compensation the most frequently addressed topic during the quarter. As you can see here, the major issue that's been under consideration is net metering successor tariffs. And specifically, states are reconsidering the credit rates that are paid for energy exported to the grid and the period over which these exports are calculated. So is it a traditional monthly netting period, or is it an hourly or 15-minute or an instantaneous netting period? Currently, 40 states plus DC offer traditional retail rate net metering, with 6 of these states in transition to a different compensation mechanism, but still offering net metering for now. In Michigan, the successor tariff is being implemented in individual utility rate cases. So DTE Electric and the Upper Peninsula Power Company have already transitioned to their new inflow-outflow tariffs for DG customers, but the other utilities in the state have not done so yet. And a new tariff will be taking effect in Louisiana in January, which I'll explain in just a moment. And there are 5 states, Arizona, Georgia, Hawaii, Mississippi, and Utah, that have DG compensation rules other than net metering currently in effect. And another 5 states, the ones here in light blue and in gray, that do not have any statewide net metering or DG compensation rules. So there are a number of major net metering proceedings underway across the country right now. Most notably, in Q3 2019, the Louisiana Public Service Commission approved a net metering successor tariff. This tariff takes the form of net billing. It allows on-site consumption of energy, but it credits all energy that's exported to the grid in real time at the utility's avoided cost rate. So this will become effective for new net metering customers as of January 1st, 2020, and existing customers will be grandfathered for 15 years. And the final decision also allows utilities to recover lost utility revenues from net metering customers, which is kind of an interesting feature there. The Arkansas Public Service Commission also has a major net metering proceeding open. This proceeding has been ongoing for a few years now, but legislation enacted earlier this year provides some further guidance for that successor tariff. So a net metering working group has been meeting to develop recommendations on the contested portions of that legislation, which are basically the credit rates, the netting period, and the rate design for a successor tariff. And this group was unable to reach consensus on any of these issues, so the commission staff filed a straw proposal in September as a starting point that only includes the statutory provisions from this bill. The Kentucky Public Service Commission opened a new proceeding in July to implement net metering legislation that was also enacted earlier in the year. The commission is tasked with establishing new credit rates for net metering. And this proceeding will specifically collect comments from stakeholders in order to build a record for making this decision in individual utility rate cases. There's a pretty broad rulemaking related to net metering underway in Vermont right now. This proceeding began by largely focusing on the definition of a preferred site. And so projects in Vermont that are located on these preferred sites receive a higher credit rate. But last quarter, the commission filed a request for information from stakeholders that focuses on the costs and benefits of net metering, cost shift issues, and potential changes to credit rates, such as time varying rates. So there could potentially be some more significant changes under consideration in Vermont. And in Wyoming, a state that has been pretty light on solar policy activity over the last few years, The legislative committee has been addressing net metering during their interim period. A draft bill that's been circulated would allow net metering for systems over the current 25 kilowatt size cap, but it would also move the state to a buy-all, sell-all structure with energy production credited at the avoided cost rate. So Wyoming is definitely a state to watch in the upcoming legislative session. So here are a few other notable net metering actions from the recent quarter. The Hawaii Public Utilities Commission expanded HELCO's Smart Export Program by 5 megawatts. And the commission also opened a new docket to investigate both existing and new DER programs. The Maine Public Utilities Commission approved revised net metering rules in July that increased the threshold level of aggregate installed capacity. So basically a discretionary aggregate cap that triggers a review of the rules from 1% of peak demand up to 10% of peak demand. So putting off that review of rules for quite some time. In New Hampshire, the governor vetoed a bill in June that would have increased the net metering system size limit from 1 megawatt all the way up to 5 megawatts. But the state house failed to override this veto during Q3 2019. And Washington regulators approved revised net metering tariffs for the state's utilities that implement legislation enacted earlier in the year. The revised tariffs specify that they'll be available until June 30th, 2029, or when their newly established aggregate cap of 4% of 1996 peak demand is reached. The revised tariffs also include some modified meter aggregation provisions. So now moving on to residential fixed charge increases. We found that there were 40 utility requests to increase residential fixed charges or minimum bills by at least 10%, pending or decided in 25 states and DC during Q3 2019. So these increases are proposed as part of utilities' general rate cases. Now, one of the trends that we've recently noticed has been utilities proposing somewhat fewer and more modest residential fixed charge increases. So you can see here that many of the general rate cases that were pending last quarter either did not include a residential fixed charge increase at all, or that increase was less than 10%. In Q3 2019 specifically, the median increase under consideration was $3 or 32%, which is lower than what we've seen compared to the last few years, as Brian mentioned earlier. The proposals ranged from $1.12 all the way up to $10.41. And of the 40 requests that were considered during the quarter, 34 of these remained pending at the end of the quarter. The largest requests that were considered were put forward by Southern California Edison, Entergy New Orleans, Empire District Electric in Oklahoma, Georgia Power, and Entergy Louisiana. There were 10 utilities that filed new proposals to increase residential fixed charges in Q3 2019. You can see there's quite a range in these proposals, with the largest one coming from a co-op here in North Carolina. Regulators also issued decisions on 6 utility requests to increase fixed charges. The median increase that was granted was $1.06, or a 14% increase in the charge. And on average, utilities received about 56% of what they had originally requested. You can see here that the decisions vary substantially, though, especially when you start comparing public power utilities to investor-owned utilities. So the full fixed charge increases for both of the co-ops shown here were approved. Now looking at residential demand and solar customer charges, we found that there were 6 actions taken in 5 states in Q3 2019. 4 of these are proposals to adopt new charges. 1 is a challenge to an existing charge, and the last action is a request to increase that same existing charge. Here are a few highlights from the quarter. The Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities rejected National Grid's proposed minimum monthly reliability contribution, or their MMRC, which is applicable to net metering customers specifically. The DPU is authorized to approve an MMRC, and it did so for Eversource last year, but then legislation changing the requirements for an MMRC made Eversource no longer in compliance. So a utility in Massachusetts doesn't yet have this type of charge in place. Eversource's would have been a demand charge plus a fixed charge, while National Grid's proposal was just a fixed charge. So the DPU and its orders that instead it wants the state's utilities to work together on a standardized MMRC structure. In Vermont, regulators approved a new charge for Green Mountain Power in July. This is an upfront fee as opposed to a monthly fee, and it's only applicable to customers that are installing projects on certain circuits that need upgrades. And lastly, We Energies in Wisconsin had proposed a new charge for its energy-only net metering customers that would have ended up based on the customer's monthly peak generation. But the utility ultimately withdrew the proposed charge in a settlement in July. And our last category here is utility-led rooftop solar program action. We saw only 2 states take actions related to these type of programs last quarter. There continues to be just a handful of states or utilities considering these programs at any given time. Utility ownership of solar is one of many topics under consideration in Arkansas's grid modernization and DER investigatory proceeding that's ongoing right now. While Entergy Mississippi filed plans for a smart energy services program earlier this year, or last year actually, that would involve utility-owned DER options for their customers. And interestingly, last quarter, the Wisconsin Public Service Commission approved Wisconsin Power and Light's proposal for a 35-megawatt customer-hosted renewables program. So under this program, the utility will own solar and potentially energy storage systems on customer properties and then provide them with bill credits. So this has been a little bit controversial, though, because the legality of third-party leasing and PPAs still remains uncertain in Wisconsin. All right, so now let's move on to the Q4 update and outlook. Activity has slowed down significantly on the legislative side, since most state legislatures have already adjourned or they're in recess for the rest of the year. And many states do, however, allow legislation to carry over from 2019 to 2020. Massachusetts remains in session right now and has a number of bills related to net metering and community solar under consideration. Many of these bills would increase or eliminate the aggregate cap on net metering. And there are also several bills in New York that will be carried over to 2020 for consideration. So we expect to see a lot of legislation next year addressing net metering successor tariffs and community solar, since these have been 2 particularly hot topics at state legislatures. And most states will begin their 2020 legislative sessions in January. Now on the regulatory side, a few highlights here. The Alabama Public Service Commission scheduled a hearing for November regarding a challenge to Alabama Power's existing $5 per kilowatt solar capacity charge. The Arkansas Public Service Commission is continuing to work to implement the net metering legislation enacted earlier this year. Parties filed initial comments on the staff strawman proposal earlier this month. In Connecticut, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority is working to establish the scope for a value of DER study that will inform the development of the state's net metering successor tariff. In Idaho, stakeholders filed a settlement agreement regarding Idaho Power's net metering successor tariff just this month. So under the proposed settlement, the new tariff would net production and consumption on an hourly basis, with net exports being credited at a rate that includes the avoided energy value, avoided capacity value, avoided transmission and distribution capacity and line losses, the environmental benefits, and integration costs. So the initial export rate would be about 4.4 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. In the settlement, though, it doesn't resolve the issue of grandfathering. So what happens to existing customers is still very much up for debate. Parties filed comments in Kentucky's net metering successor tariff investigation in October. In Massachusetts, utilities will be working to develop a standardized structure for that minimum monthly reliability contribution per the DPU's order. In Minnesota, the commission is considering Xcel Energy's proposal to modify the value of solar methodology. So the value of solar there is used as compensation for community solar, and it's scheduled to increase from its current 11.09 cents per kilowatt hour all the way up to 24.94 cents per kilowatt hour next year under the current methodology that's used. So Xcel is specifically requesting changes to the way that avoided distribution capacity costs are calculated. Moving on, a decision is expected in Northwestern Energy's rate case in Montana. Northwestern's application includes a separate rate class for their residential net metering customers, as well as a demand charge for these customers. In South Carolina, work is beginning to conduct a net metering cost benefit study and develop a successor tariff that will go into effect in June 2021. The commission is also addressing community solar, as Brian mentioned. A net metering rulemaking remains open in Vermont, with stakeholders filing comments on a number of issues related to the cost and benefits net metering and potential rule changes this month. And the West Virginia Public Service Commission issued an order in its net metering proceeding this month. The commission decided that it will address tariff issues in individual rate cases rather than in this proceeding, but it did approve the utility's request to require a second meter for new customer generators. And we also track all general rate cases as part of our Desire Insight Solar subscriptions. So we're expecting a number of major cases to be filed in Q4 2019. Utilities in Arizona, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and North Carolina have all indicated that they will be filing rate cases. We've been seeing a lot of utilities file major proposals as part of their general rate cases. So things like net metering changes, grid modernization plans, and electric vehicle programs. So rate cases are definitely an important area to be watching. And a settlement agreement is pending in CenterPoint Energy's rate case in Texas. And the Oklahoma Corporation Commission issued a decision in Empire District Electric's case this month, which approves a settlement agreement keeping the residential fixed charge at its current rate. So that wraps up our distributed solar policy review and update. And I think we'd be happy to answer any questions right now. And also feel free to reach out to us via email with questions.
So we have a question from, looks like Melanie Manis. I'm sorry, I'm not saying your name right. Please define community solar.
That's a tricky question. I think everyone seems to have a different definition of community solar. For our purposes, we consider these to be programs where individuals are participating, whether it's through a subscription or an ownership of an actual share, rather than, say, a green power purchasing program that a utility may offer. Some of these programs may provide the customer with a direct financial savings, and some of them may be a premium program. So there's a lot of variation, I think, between different community solar programs. Do you have anything to add?
Nope. Just that it's called different things in different places. Some states call it, Colorado and Minnesota, for example, they like the term community solar gardens, which is pretty cute. Others might refer to it as neighborhood net metering or virtual net metering. And in some cases, those terms can actually functionally be different. But for the most part, we're talking about customers receiving some benefit from a system located off-site from where they live. Let's see, another question from Bruce Hunn. I understand that general administrative costs, billing, reporting, customer service, etc., as well as transmission and distribution costs are included in the fixed monthly charge. Is this always the case, or the case for most utilities? Are T&D costs sometimes included elsewhere in the rate structure?
I think it depends on the utility. Yeah, the cost allocation definitely is dependent from state to state and utility to utility. I think in restructured states, it tends to be a bit more transparent, and sometimes the T&D is actually, it's broken out from generation, and so it's a bit more clear. But I think in those states, a lot of times I've seen those as variable charges. So I think it just really depends, and is certainly something that's being debated in rate cases right now.
We have a pair of questions from Mark Musteller. Could you expand on the difference between net metering and net billing, and maybe a brief definition of net metering successor tariff? You want to handle that one, Autumn?
Sure. So again, this is, I think, one of those things where people tend to have their own definitions, so it can become very confusing. But for our purposes, we try to be at least consistent in our terminology, and we consider net metering to be a program that allows the one-to-one offsetting of production and consumption over the billing period. So basically, you're getting a retail rate credit for all of your production during the month. And then what's carried over potentially to the next month may be credited at a different rate, but at least during that billing period, you have that one-to-one netting going on at the meter level. And then for net billing, we consider that to be when the netting happens over a period that is less than the billing period. So typically that's been 15 minutes, 60 minutes, or even real time. So we consider all of those to be net billing, but then the credit rate that's provided for those exports over whatever that netting period is, that credit rate varies substantially within these programs. So sometimes it's an avoided cost rate, other times it may be a value of solar type rate. So I think there's a lot of variability within what we consider to be net billing. And then I guess the other framework that we see much less commonly is the buy all sell all, where all production is credited at a separate rate, and then all consumption is purchased at the retail rate. So there's completely separate, and there's none of that on-site consumption of energy. And then a net metering successor tariff, I think we kind of use that term a bit loosely just to refer to a change in the net metering policy of a state that changes it to something other than net metering, as we define it, as that one-to-one offsetting.
Some tech-minded people might also refer to it as net metering 2.0.
Yeah.
I don't hear those terms. All right, let's see. Any comments?
A couple more coming in.
See one from James here. Any comments on federal policy, in particular ITC extension supported by SEA, or FERC mandates for storage and distributed resources? I can't really weigh in on the likelihood of an ITC extension other than the fact that SEA is full force on that. That gets into a realm of politics and lobbying that I'm terrified of and stay away from. Autumn, do you have anything to add about FERC mandates for storage? And DERs?
No, we've been tracking some activity at FERC. I think there's a DER aggregation docket. There's the energy storage dockets open for participation in wholesale markets. And then there's also a FERC NOPR right now for PURPA policies for larger solar. So they're all issues that we're tracking, and I think it's pretty uncertain right now exactly what's going to happen.
And then from David Large, great last name from your lips. Do you track changes from flat utility rates to time of use rates? We do in our 50 States of Grid Modernization reports. We see several states transitioning to kind of default time of use rates. And so we do track those, again, in that other report, not in our solar report.
We do track any states that are considering changing their net metering rates or requirements for net metering customers to be on time varying rates. So like California, we've been tracking that in the solar report as well.
Yeah. And then a question from Josh Clark. We have talked a lot about policies changing for the worse. Yeah. Have you identified any states where policy is looking up? South Carolina, they passed major energy legislation this past summer, which holds a lot of promise for that state. Perhaps in response to the kind of nuclear financing disaster that happened there. I think in general, the utilities are on kind of the naughty list in both Carolina legislatures. So that South Carolina bill, I think, makes South Carolina look a little positive. Any other states up mind, Autumn?
On the net metering front, it usually has been tending to go toward the direction that reduces value for solar. But I think a lot of the bright spot in what we track has been community solar. So there's been a lot of activity really increasing on the community solar front, especially at state legislatures. So we've been seeing gradually more and more states adopt policies enabling that.
Well, if you're looking beyond solar, there's a lot of activity in the states related to energy storage right now, which we're tracking in our grid mod report. Lots of states expanding their net metering rules to allow for storage, states adopting energy storage targets.
And I think we don't track incentives for solar in this report, but I think there's an Oregon solar rebate that was just enacted this year. So that's also a potential bright spot there.
Let's see, what steps would you recommend to a residential solar owner who feels they are being taken advantage of by the utility company? Utility commissions are the public venue to air grievances and have your voice heard if you want to wade into that territory. Also, if your state has a local ASES or SEA chapter, you could consider joining them and working with them to address these grievances.
You could also reach out to your state's consumer advocate office. It's the North Carolina Public Staff here in North Carolina, since they're tasked with looking out for ratepayer interests.
And of course, your local politician, your representative in the state. Let's see. A question from James. Any comments on trends towards or away from residential demand charges in utility rates for DER customers? I think that's one we can speak to.
Yeah, we've seen a number of proposals for residential demand charges over the last few years, but only I think 3 have been actually approved. One of those was at Massachusetts MMRC that was ultimately not put into effect. And then the other 2 are in Kansas, where the commission had issued a ruling a few years ago, pretty much saying that demand charges are okay. So the utilities went ahead and proposed those. So there are residential demand charges for DG customers for a couple of utilities in Kansas. But aside from that, almost I mean, all of the rest of the proposals have been rejected by utility commissions, so they're really struggling to see success in those. And I think we've been seeing fewer of those proposals coming forward. Lately, we've been seeing more on the types of charges that are based on your system's capacity rather than your monthly demand. But even those haven't been getting approved. So I would say it's probably unlikely that we'll see a lot more of those right now.
Looks like one more question from Mark. If environmental benefits are included in value of DG, can you briefly describe how those are calculated? That's a good question, and one that I don't know off the top of my head. I know the EPA has some methodologies for some of these costs, maybe carbon costs and certain contaminant costs.
Yeah, I think first it depends what exactly is included in environmental benefits. So for the most part, a lot of times that's only carbon costs or only environmental compliance. So it may be the value of RECs in a state for environmental compliance, or maybe the social cost of carbon may be used to calculate the carbon benefits. And the EPA, they have their AVERT tool that I think is used in a lot of studies to calculate those benefits. And then you can even look at other pollutants or land use issues, which I think are even trickier to calculate. So I think it depends what you include, but RECs and a carbon price are kind of the starting point.
All right, wonderful. It looks like those are all of our questions with just a couple minutes left. Are there any other comments from you guys, Autumn or Brian?
No, you have our emails there. If you want to reach out and touch us, go for it. And again, don't be bashful in checking out desireinsight.com.
All right, wonderful. Thank you guys so much for putting this webinar on for us. We really appreciate it, and such great content that you guys shared with us today. We're really appreciative here at ASES.
Well, thank you, Carly, and thanks to the audience and the people that gave those great questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being on the webinar today. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact Brian or Autumn or myself. You can contact us at ASES, membership@ases.org, if you have any questions in regards to the webinar today. The recording of today's webinar will be up on our YouTube channel within the next week, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks again, everyone.